The clock arrived without warning, an antique thing of brass and glass with tarnished hands that pointed to 12, even though it was much earlier. There was no return address on the package, just the bold letters that read, "For you." Amanda and Derek stared at it on their doorstep, confused. "Did you order this?" Derek asked, nudging the heavy box with his foot. Amanda shook her head, her brow furrowed. "No, maybe it's a mistake." It wasn't. They dragged the thing inside, its weight surprising, feeling wrong for something so relatively small. The clock had a brass frame, glass doors that swung open on tiny hinges, and the face was ornate, almost too intricate for a mere timepiece. It sat silently on the mantel, its hands never moving, even when Derek wound it up, curious to see if it still worked. "I think it's just broken," he muttered, his fingers still dusty from the winding key. "Maybe it's just decoration, or maybe we should get rid of it," Amanda said, feeling uneasy. Something about the clock unnerved her, though she couldn't put her finger on why. Derek shrugged. "We'll decide later." That night, Amanda woke to the soft tick of the clock. She frowned, sitting up in bed. She could have sworn Derek hadn't fixed it. Yet there it was. She could hear the tick, slow and deliberate, echoing through the house. The air felt heavier, as though the very walls were thick with something unseen. Amanda climbed out of bed and padded to the living room, where the clock sat, now fully alive. Her breath caught. The hands had moved. It was 3 minutes to midnight. She stood frozen, staring at the clock, her heart hammering. It was impossible. Derek had wound it, yes, but it hadn't worked. A groan echoed through the house, long and drawn out. The kind of sound that settles in your bones, making your skin crawl. Amanda's pulse quickened as she backed away from the clock. Suddenly the bell began to chime, 12 slow, deafening tolls. The floor creaked behind her. Amanda whirled around, her heart in her throat, but there was nothing there, or at least nothing she could see. She was alone in the dark, but she felt watched. Something was in the room with her. And then, the cold settled in, a chill that gripped her, suffocating. A figure began to form out of the shadows, a shape that seemed to ooze from the air itself. It was tall, grotesque, with hollow eyes and skin stretched too tightly over its face. Long fingers that ended in sharp, claw-like nails twitched at its side. Amanda stumbled back, her scream caught in her throat. The figure didn't move. It simply stood there, as though it were waiting for something. As the clock finished its chime, the figure dissolved back into the shadows, and the ticking of the clock stopped. Amanda rushed back to the bedroom, slamming the door behind her. "What the hell?" she whispered, her whole body shaking. The next morning, Amanda told Derek about the clock. "It was working," she said, her voice trembling. And there was something. I don't know how to describe it, it just appeared. Derek frowned, but gave her a comforting smile. "It's probably just your mind playing tricks. Old clocks like that, maybe it chimed randomly. As for the figure, maybe it was just shadows. You were tired." Amanda knew it wasn't that simple, but Derek's logic was grounding. That night, the clock struck midnight again. This time, both of them were awake to hear it. The ticking, slow and deliberate, was followed by the dreadful chime. Amanda clutched Derek's arm as the 12 tolls rang out, the sound heavy and oppressive. They could feel it in their chests, each ring making the air heavier, thicker. Then, from the darkness, the figure emerged once more, dragging itself from the corners of the room. It moved closer, its hollow eyes fixed on the couple, its presence reeking of death and decay. As it approached, the temperature in the room plummeted. Derek gasped, backing away with Amanda. The creature reached out, long fingers stretching toward them. They bolted for the bedroom, slamming the door behind them, hearts racing. The next morning, the clock was gone. They searched the living room, then the entire house, but the clock had vanished without a trace. Relief washed over them, though it was tainted with a deep unease. That night, they found the clock in their kitchen. Its hands were still, pointed at 12. Amanda's stomach turned. She wanted to scream, to smash it to pieces, but Derek stopped her. "Let's just get rid of it," he said. They took the clock outside, throwing it into the garbage bin at the edge of their yard. Amanda watched as Derek slammed the lid closed, then turned back to the house. The air was thick with tension, but they forced themselves to go to bed. At midnight, the chime started again. The clock was back, sitting on the mantel in their living room as though it had never been moved. The sound of its ticking grew louder, echoing through the halls. They rushed to the living room, only to see the hands move with agonizing slowness. The chime began, and the figure emerged once more. This time, it was closer. Derek grabbed Amanda's hand. "We need to leave." They didn't pack anything. They just left the house, getting in the car and driving to a hotel miles away. But even there, neither could sleep. The tension clung to them like a wet cloth suffocating. The next morning, they returned to the house, cautiously stepping inside. The clock was gone. They sighed in relief, though the dread never fully left them. But that night, as the clock struck midnight, they woke to find it in their bedroom. The figure was already waiting. It stood in the corner watching them. Its hollow eyes gleamed in the dim light, and its long fingers twitched. Amanda screamed as it moved toward them, slowly, dragging itself closer. They ran, but the figure seemed to follow them no matter where they went. The clock followed too, always reappearing. They tried to destroy it, smashing it with hammers, setting it on fire. But no matter what they did, it returned the next night, unscathed, always ticking, always counting down to midnight. And each time the figure drew closer. Days passed, but neither Amanda nor Derek could leave. It was as though the house had trapped them, keeping them within its walls. Every night, the clock would strike midnight, and the figure would come, closer and closer, reaching for them. They grew weaker, exhausted by the nightly terror, unable to sleep, unable to eat. They watched as the figure's touch began to reach them in small, terrible ways. Scratches on their skin, bruises forming in the shapes of long, slender fingers. One night, Amanda collapsed, shaking violently as the clock began to chime. She tried to scream, but no sound came out. Derek was at her side, but he could do nothing. The figure emerged once more, its long fingers stretching out toward them. This time, they felt the pull. It was dragging them. Slowly, inch by inch, they were being pulled into the shadows. Amanda's legs gave way as she was dragged toward the dark corners of the room. Derek clung to her, screaming her name, but it was no use. The clock's chime echoed, louder and louder, until it was all they could hear, their world reduced to the ticking in the darkness. The figure's hollow eyes gleamed as they were pulled closer, its grip cold and relentless. And then, with the final toll of the clock, they were gone. The clock sat still once more, its hands frozen at midnight, and in the silence of the empty house, the only sound was the faint tick of the clock, waiting for its next victims. Sarah lived alone in an old, creaky apartment building that had seen better days. Nestled in a forgotten corner of the city, the building was a relic of a bygone era. It had tall windows that overlooked a quiet, narrow street, its brick facade chipped and weathered, and hallways that always seemed just a little too dark. The rent was cheap, and that was enough for Sarah, who worked long hours as a graphic designer and preferred the solitude of her home to the chaos of the world outside. She liked the quiet. It gave her time to think, to be alone with her thoughts after stressful days. But in the past week, something had changed. It started small, an uneasy feeling, a prickling on the back of her neck as if she were being watched. The creaks and groans of the apartment, which she'd once found charming, now seemed ominous, like the building itself was trying to tell her something. Then the phone calls started. It was always late at night, just after midnight. The first time it happened, Sarah had been drifting off to sleep, the soft glow of the street lamp filtering through her curtains. Her phone rang, shrill and jarring, pulling her from the edge of sleep. She groggily reached for it, squinting at the unknown number on the screen. "Hello," she muttered, her voice thick with exhaustion. There was silence on the other end. No static, no background noise, just a heavy, suffocating silence. She waited a few seconds before hanging up, her heart pounding a little faster than it should have. Maybe it was a wrong number, she told herself. But the uneasy feeling from earlier lingered, clinging to her like a damp fog. The next night, the call came again. Same time, same unknown number. This time, Sarah hesitated before answering. She stared at the glowing screen for a moment, her thumb hovering over the accept button before she finally pressed it. "Hello?" she said again, more awake this time. And again there was silence. But just as she was about to hang up, she heard something, a faint sound, like breathing. It was soft, barely perceptible, but it was there. "Who is this?" she demanded, her voice shaking slightly. No response. The breathing stopped, and after a few more agonizing seconds, she hung up. She lay in bed, staring up at the ceiling, her mind racing. Was someone messing with her? A prank? But who would go through the trouble? The next night, it happened again. This time, Sarah didn't answer. She let the phone ring, watching it vibrate on the nightstand until the ringing stopped. But now, she couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't alone. Every creak, every gust of wind outside her window made her jump. She double-checked the locks on her door, closed the curtains tighter, but it didn't help. Sleep was elusive. By the fourth night, she was a wreck. Dark circles framed her eyes, and her nerves were frayed. When the phone rang again just after midnight, she snatched it up without thinking. Who the hell is this? She shouted into the phone, her voice shaky and panicked. This time there was no silence. A voice came through the line, soft, familiar, and terrifying all at once. Sarah. She froze. The voice on the other end wasn't just familiar, it was her own. A perfect, eerie mirror of her own voice, only it was different. There was something off about it. It sounded hollow, distant, like it was coming from somewhere far away. Who is this? She whispered, her heart pounding in her chest. You know who this is, the voice responded, calm and measured. It's you, Sarah. Sarah felt her stomach drop. This had to be a joke. Someone was playing a sick joke on her. But how? How could someone perfectly mimic her voice like that? You don't believe me, do you? Her voice continued. But you will. You don't have much time. What are you talking about? Sarah asked, her voice shaking. What do you want? There was a pause, and then the voice said something that chilled her to her core. I'm trying to help you. I'm trying to save you. Save me? From what? From what's coming, from what you can't escape. Sarah sat up in bed, her heart racing. This isn't funny, she snapped. I don't know who you are, but I'm calling the police. You won't, the voice said, almost amused. You're too scared to, and it wouldn't matter if you did. You can't change what's going to happen. Tears welled up in Sarah's eyes and she gripped the phone tightly. What are you talking about? What's going to happen? There was another long pause before the voice responded, softer this time. You're going to die, Sarah, soon, and there's nothing you can do to stop it. Sarah's blood ran cold. She hung up, her hands trembling as she threw the phone across the room. She sat there in the dark, her mind spinning, trying to make sense of what had just happened. This was crazy. It had to be some kind of elaborate prank. But deep down, a gnawing feeling of dread had taken root in her stomach, and no matter how much she tried to rationalize it, she couldn't shake it. The calls kept coming. Every night just after midnight, the phone would ring, and every night Sarah would answer, and her voice, would tell her more. Horrible things, things that made her skin crawl. Details about her life, things no one else could possibly know. Private thoughts, secret fears. The voice knew everything, and every night it would end the same way, with the same chilling warning. You can't escape what's coming. Sarah tried to ignore it. She stopped answering the phone, but the calls didn't stop. The phone would ring, and even though she didn't pick up, she could feel the presence of the voice, as if it were lurking in the shadows, waiting for her. She considered leaving, packing up and moving somewhere far away, somewhere the voice couldn't find her. But deep down, she knew it wouldn't make a difference. The voice had told her as much. You can't escape, it had said, no matter where you go. Sleep became impossible. Every night she would lie in bed, staring at the ceiling, her mind racing with thoughts of the voice, of what it had said. She stopped going to work, stopped answering calls from friends. Her world became smaller and smaller, confined to the dark, claustrophobic walls of her apartment. One night, after a particularly long day of trying and failing to sleep, Sarah finally broke. She picked up the phone when it rang, her hands trembling with fear and exhaustion. Why are you doing this? She whispered, her voice barely audible. The voice on the other end didn't answer immediately. When it finally did, it was softer, almost sad. Because I have to. Because it's the only way. The only way to what? To warn you. To prepare you. Sarah felt a tear slip down her cheek. Prepare me for what? There was a long, heavy silence, and then the voice responded, so quietly that Sarah had to strain to hear it. For what's already happened. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. What do you mean? You don't remember, do you? The voice asked, its tone almost pitying. You've already lived this. You've already been here, in this moment. You've already made these choices. Sarah's head was spinning. None of this made any sense. That's impossible, she whispered. Is it? The voice countered. Think about it. The calls, the warnings. The feeling that you can't escape. It's because you've already tried, over and over again. And it always ends the same way. No, Sarah said, shaking her head. That's not true. It can't be. It is, the voice said softly. And you know it. Deep down, you've always known. Sarah felt like the walls were closing in on her. She couldn't breathe, couldn't think. What do I do? She asked, her voice trembling. There was a pause, and then the voice responded, You can't change it. No matter what you do, no matter how hard you try, it always ends the same. You can't escape your fate. Sarah sobbed, gripping the phone so tightly her knuckles turned white. Please, she whispered. Please tell me what to do. I'm sorry, the voice said, its tone full of sorrow. But this is how it has to be. You can't escape it. And then the line went dead. Sarah sat there in the dark, the phone still pressed to her ear, the silence in the room deafening. She didn't know how long she sat there, her mind numb, her body frozen. The voice's words echoed in her head, over and over again. You can't escape. She didn't sleep that night. When the sun finally rose, she felt like a ghost of herself, hollow and drained. She went through the motions of her day, barely aware of what she was doing. She felt like she was walking through a dream, or rather, a nightmare she couldn't wake up from. That night, she didn't wait for the phone to ring. She picked it up at midnight, dialed her own number, and waited. The line rang once, twice, and then it was answered. Hello, came the voice on the other end. Her voice. Sarah's heart pounded in her chest. She didn't speak, didn't breathe. Hello, the voice repeated, sounding confused now. And then, in a moment of terrifying clarity, Sarah realized what was happening. The voice on the other end, the voice she had been hearing all along, wasn't some prankster. It wasn't a stranger. It was her. But it wasn't the her from now. It was the her from before whatever happened, before the fate she couldn't escape. The truth crashed over her like a wave, and she understood. She'd been calling herself, warning herself, trying to stop the inevitable, to change the outcome. But it hadn't worked. It never worked, because she couldn't escape. She dropped the phone, her hands shaking. The air in the room felt thick, suffocating. She knew now. She understood. And then, as she stood there in the suffocating silence of her apartment, she heard it, the faint sound of footsteps behind her. Her breath hitched in her throat. She didn't need to turn around. She already knew what was there, her fate. And it had finally caught up with her. The last thing she heard was her own voice, whispering in her ear, You can't escape. It was supposed to be just another night of harmless fun, an impromptu adventure fueled by boredom and a thirst for something exciting. That's how it always started for Ethan, Olivia, Max, and Jenna. They had been inseparable since high school, a tight-knit group of friends that had managed to stick together through college and into their 20s. Tonight, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of purple and orange, Ethan proposed something different. There's an old radio station out on Route 23, he said, leaning back against the hood of his car, eyes glinting with mischief. It's been abandoned for decades. Want to check it out? Olivia groaned, rolling her eyes. Seriously? An abandoned building? You can't think of anything better? I'm in, Max said, shrugging. Could be fun. Jenna hesitated, biting her lip. I don't know. What if we get caught? By who? Ethan grinned. It's in the middle of nowhere. Besides, we'll be careful. We'll just look around and leave. They all piled into Ethan's car, a beat-up SUV that had seen better days. The engine sputtered to life, and they drove off, laughing and joking as they made their way out of town. The streets grew quieter, the houses fewer, and soon they were surrounded by the dark, open expanse of the countryside. The moon was full, casting a ghostly glow over the fields and the winding road ahead. As they approached the station, it came into view, a squat, dilapidated building, half hidden behind overgrown bushes and tall grass. The structure was old, its paint peeling and windows broken, but there was something eerie about it, something that made the air feel heavier. Ethan parked the car, and they all stepped out, peering at the building in silence. This place looks like it's straight out of a horror movie, Max said, chuckling nervously. Yeah, no kidding, Olivia replied, shivering slightly. Let's make this quick. They walked up to the entrance, the crunch of gravel under their feet the only sound breaking the stillness of the night. The front door was ajar, hanging on its hinges, and Ethan pushed it open with a loud creak. They stepped inside, their flashlights cutting through the darkness. The interior was a mess. Dust-covered furniture, broken chairs, and scattered papers littered the floor. The air was thick, stale, and carried a faint, metallic odor that none of them could quite place. "Looks like nobody's been here in years," Jenna whispered, her voice barely audible. "That's because nobody has," Ethan replied. "It's been abandoned since the 80s. As they ventured further inside, they found themselves in what must have been the control room. The walls were lined with equipment, old, bulky radios, tape decks, and switchboards, all coated in a fine layer of dust. Yet, despite the decay, there was something off. The equipment was still powered on. Tiny lights blinked, dials twitched, and a low static-filled hum emanated from the speakers. "Is this stuff running?" Max asked, frowning. Ethan stepped closer to one of the machines, running his fingers over the controls. "I guess so. Weird. How's it even getting power?" "It shouldn't be," Olivia said, glancing around uneasily. "There's no way this place is still connected to the grid." "Maybe there's a generator?" Max suggested, but his voice lacked conviction. They all stood there, listening to the soft crackle of static. It was strange, almost hypnotic, and then, without warning, the static shifted. The speakers crackled louder, and a faint, distorted melody began to play, a slow, mournful tune that echoed through the room. It was accompanied by a voice, barely audible, speaking in a language none of them could understand. Olivia's skin prickled, and she took a step back. "Okay, this is seriously creepy." Ethan, however, was intrigued. "Wait, let's see what else we can find." He flipped a few switches, and the sound grew clearer. The music stopped, replaced by the sound of someone breathing, followed by a whisper that sent chills down their spines. "Help us." Jenna's eyes widened. "Did you hear that?" "Yeah, I heard it," Max said, his voice unsteady. "Let's get out of here." But Ethan was already reaching for the tape deck. "Hold on, I want to record this." As he pressed the record button, the whispering grew louder, more frantic. Words jumbled together, incoherent and desperate, and then, suddenly, there was silence. The equipment powered down, the lights flickering off, plunging them into darkness. The only sound was their own breathing, quick and shallow. "What the hell was that?" Olivia whispered. Before anyone could answer, the equipment powered back on, and the tape deck began to play. But instead of the eerie whispering, they heard their own voices, distorted and echoing as if recorded through a broken radio. "We shouldn't be here. Let's get out." "Turn it off, Ethan. Help us." It was like listening to a conversation they hadn't had yet, their voices layered over each other, filled with fear. The final words on the recording sent a shiver down their spines. "We're trapped. Please, someone, help us." Ethan fumbled with the controls, trying to stop the recording, but the tape kept playing, repeating the same phrases over and over again, faster and faster, until it was just a jumbled mess of noise. Finally, he yanked the power cord, and the room fell silent. Jenna was trembling. "That was us. How? How is that possible?" "I don't know," Ethan said, his voice barely more than a whisper, "but I think we need to leave. Now." They turned to go, but as they stepped into the hallway, they were met with a chilling sight. The door they had entered through was no longer there. In its place was a solid wall, as if the entrance had never existed. "Guys," Max said, panic rising in his voice. "Where's the door?" Ethan ran his hands over the wall, searching for a seam, a crack, anything. But there was nothing, just cold, unyielding concrete. "We're trapped," Olivia said, her voice trembling. "How is this happening?" "It's just a prank," Ethan said, though he didn't sound convinced. "Someone's messing with us." They moved through the station, searching for another way out, but every door they found led to a dead end. The building was like a maze, twisting and turning in ways that didn't make sense. Rooms that should have connected didn't, and hallways looped back on themselves. The equipment continued to hum, broadcasting that same distorted music, and every so often they would hear voices, faint, distant, but unmistakably their own, crying out for help. It was as if the station was alive, feeding on their fear, pulling them deeper into its labyrinth. Hours passed, or maybe it was minutes. It was impossible to tell. The air grew colder, and the lights dimmed, casting long flickering shadows on the walls. They were exhausted, their nerves frayed, but they couldn't stop moving, couldn't stop searching for a way out. Eventually they stumbled upon a room they hadn't seen before, a small cramped space filled with old tapes, neatly stacked on shelves. Ethan picked one up, turning it over in his hands. It was labeled simply with a date, October 20th, 1983. "Let's see what's on it," he said, though the others looked less than thrilled by the idea. He slipped the tape into the deck, and the machine whirred to life. At first, there was only static, but then a voice broke through, clear and calm, as if addressing an audience. "This is WRTG Radio, signing off for the night. We'll be back at midnight with more late-night tunes and stories from the dark." Then there was silence, followed by the same distorted melody they had heard before, but this time it was accompanied by a new voice, a low, raspy whisper that sent chills down their spines. "They're here, they're watching, and they won't let you go." The tape cut out, and the room plunged into silence. Jenna clutched Max's arm, her eyes wide with fear. "We need to get out of here." They turned to leave, but the hallway was gone, replaced by a long, dark tunnel that stretched out into the distance. At the far end, they could see a faint light, flickering like a candle. "Do you think that's the way out?" Olivia asked, her voice barely more than a whisper. Ethan nodded. "It has to be. Come on." They moved down the tunnel, the light growing brighter with each step, but as they got closer, they realized it wasn't a candle or a lamp. It was the control room, and the equipment was still running, the speakers crackling with static. And then they heard it, the sound of their own voices, screaming, "Help us. Please, someone. Get us out." The cries grew louder, more desperate, echoing through the station, and they knew deep down that they weren't the first to come here, and they wouldn't be the last. The station had been abandoned, but it wasn't empty. It was waiting, always waiting, for someone to stumble in and get lost in its maze of static and shadows. And once you were in, there was no way out. The last thing they heard before the lights went out was their own voices, whispering from the speakers, a final chilling message that would haunt them forever. "We're trapped, and so are you." It was a crisp autumn afternoon when the Turner family pulled up to their new home. The house, an old Victorian structure nestled at the edge of a sleepy town, loomed ahead of them, its weathered facade hinting at years of forgotten memories. The windows, dark and hollow, reflected the overcast sky as they stepped out of the car, excitement and trepidation swirling in the air. Thomas Turner, a man in his late 30s, glanced at his wife Susan and their two children, Emily and Jake, as they unloaded the car. "It's perfect," Susan said, smiling as she took in the sprawling property. "I can't believe we found a place like this for such a great price." Thomas nodded, though a part of him couldn't shake the nagging feeling that the price had been too good. He'd been the one to find the listing, and the previous owners had been all too eager to sell. They had moved out within days of closing the deal, leaving behind a house that was fully furnished, as if they had simply vanished in the middle of the night. Thomas had brushed it off at the time, chalking it up to a rushed relocation, but now, standing in front of the house, he couldn't help but feel a strange unease. The family spent the rest of the day unpacking and settling in. The kids raced through the house, exploring every nook and cranny, while Susan busied herself in the kitchen, admiring the vintage stove and marble countertops. Thomas walked from room to room, opening windows to let in the fresh air, though the musty scent of age and disuse still clung to the walls. The house creaked and groaned as if adjusting to its new occupants. By the time evening fell, the Turner family had gathered in the living room, exhausted but happy. They sat around a fire Thomas had lit in the fireplace, the flames crackling warmly as they shared stories of their day. The flickering light cast dancing shadows on the walls, creating a cozy atmosphere that lulled them into a sense of contentment. As the night deepened, Susan glanced at her watch and sighed. "We should probably get the kids to bed. It's been a long day." Emily, who was 12, pouted but stood up obediently, while Jake, who was 8, groaned in protest. "I don't want to go to bed yet. Can we stay up a little longer?" "Tomorrow's another day, buddy," Thomas said, ruffling Jake's hair. "We'll have plenty of time to explore more of the house." Reluctantly, the children made their way upstairs to their bedrooms, leaving Thomas and Susan to enjoy a few quiet moments alone by the fire. The house had grown silent, save for the occasional creak or groan of the old wooden floors. Susan yawned and stretched, her eyes drooping with fatigue. "Come on, let's go to bed," she said, standing up and offering her hand to Thomas. Thomas smiled and took her hand, but as he stood, something caught his eye, a fleeting movement at the edge of his vision. He turned his head quickly, but there was nothing there, just the darkened hallway leading deeper into the house. He frowned but shook it off, blaming it on the flickering firelight. They made their way upstairs, the floorboards creaking beneath their feet. The hallway was long and dimly lit, the sconces on the walls casting weak pools of light. As they passed by the open doors of the children's rooms, they peeked inside. Emily was already fast asleep, curled up beneath her blankets, while Jake lay sprawled out, snoring softly. Satisfied that their kids were settled, they continued down the hall to their own room. The master bedroom was spacious, with high ceilings and a large four-poster bed draped in heavy velvet curtains. The room felt colder than the rest of the house, and Susan shivered as she climbed into bed. Thomas pulled the blankets up around them, wrapping an arm around her as they settled in for the night. But as soon as the lights went out, the atmosphere in the room seemed to change. The darkness felt oppressive, pressing in on them from all sides. Thomas lay there, staring at the ceiling, his mind buzzing with the strange feeling of being watched. He turned his head toward the window, and for a split second, he thought he saw something, a shadow, darker than the night outside, shifting near the edge of the curtains. He blinked, and it was gone. He sat up in bed, his heart pounding in his chest. "Did you see that?" he whispered to Susan, who was already half asleep. "See what?" she mumbled, her voice thick with exhaustion. Thomas hesitated, feeling foolish. "Nothing. It was probably just my imagination." Susan sighed and rolled over, pulling the blankets tighter around her. "Go to sleep, Thomas." But sleep didn't come easily that night. Thomas lay awake, listening to the sounds of the house, every creak and groan amplified in the stillness. His eyes darted around the room, searching the shadows for any sign of movement, but eventually, exhaustion took over, and he drifted into a restless sleep. The next few days passed uneventfully, though Thomas couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that had settled over him. Every now and then, he would catch a glimpse of something out of the corner of his eye, a shadow, a flicker of movement. But whenever he turned to look, there was nothing there. He told himself it was just his mind playing tricks on him, that the stress of the move was making him jumpy. But soon, the rest of the family began to notice things too. Emily was the first to mention it. One evening, as they were sitting down for dinner, she looked up from her plate, her brow furrowed. "Mom, Dad, do you ever feel like someone's watching you?" Susan and Thomas exchanged a glance. "What do you mean, sweetie?" Susan asked. Emily shrugged, her face pale. "I don't know. Sometimes when I'm in my room, I feel like there's someone standing just outside my door. But when I look, no one's there." Jake chimed in, his voice small. "I see them too, the shadows. They move when the lights are off." Thomas felt a chill run down his spine. He had been trying to ignore it, hoping it was all just in his head, but hearing his children say the same thing made it impossible to dismiss. "What kind of shadows?" Susan asked, her voice calm but her eyes betraying her concern. "They're tall," Emily said, her voice trembling slightly. "And they only come closer when the lights are off. I saw one last night. It was standing right outside my door." Jake nodded. "I saw one in my room. I turned on the light, and it disappeared." Thomas felt his stomach drop. He had seen the shadows too, but he had convinced himself they weren't real. Now, he wasn't so sure. "We'll check it out," Thomas said, trying to keep his voice steady. "It's probably just the house settling or something. Old houses make weird noises and cast strange shadows." But as the days passed, the shadows became more frequent, more persistent. They lingered just at the edge of their vision, always slipping away before anyone could get a good look. At night, the feeling of being watched became unbearable. No matter how many lights they left on, the shadows seemed to gather in the corners of the room, waiting for the moment when the lights would go out. One night, after the children had gone to bed, Thomas and Susan sat in the living room, the tension between them thick. The fire crackled in the hearth, but the warmth did little to dispel the growing sense of dread that hung over the house. "We can't keep ignoring this," Susan said, her voice barely above a whisper. "There's something wrong with this house." Thomas rubbed his temples, exhaustion weighing heavy on him. "I don't know what to do. I don't even know if it's real." "It's real, Thomas," Susan said, her voice firm. "We've all seen them. We can't pretend this is normal." Just as Susan finished speaking, the fire sputtered, the flames dimming for a moment before roaring back to life. The shadows on the walls seemed to stretch, lengthening as they crept closer. The lights in the room flickered, and for a brief, terrifying moment, the shadows moved toward them, closing in. Thomas stood up abruptly, his heart racing. "That's it, we're leaving." But as he turned to grab his keys, the lights went out completely, plunging the house into darkness. Susan gasped, her hand reaching out for him in the blackness. "Thomas?" she whispered, her voice shaking. "I'm here," he said, his voice tight with fear. "Stay close." He fumbled in the dark, his hand brushing against the cold metal of a flashlight that had been left on the coffee table. He clicked it on, the narrow beam of light cutting through the thick shadows, but the shadows didn't retreat. Instead, they seemed to pulse, shifting and writhing at the edges of the light, as if waiting for the moment when the batteries would die. Suddenly, from upstairs, there was a loud crash, followed by the sound of Emily screaming. "Emily!" Susan shouted, bolting toward the stairs. Thomas was right behind her, his flashlight beam bouncing wildly as they raced up the steps. They burst into Emily's room, their breaths coming in ragged gasps. The room was in disarray, the furniture overturned, and Emily was huddled in the corner, her eyes wide with terror. Jake stood in the doorway, clutching his stuffed animal, tears streaming down his face. "They were in my room," Emily sobbed. "They were everywhere. I couldn't get away." Susan rushed to her daughter, wrapping her arms around her as she tried to calm her down. Thomas swept the flashlight across the room, but the shadows had already retreated, slinking back into the corners as if mocking him. "We're leaving," Thomas said, his voice grim. "Now." The family quickly gathered what they could, throwing clothes and essentials into bags as they prepared to flee the house. But as they moved through the darkened hallways, the shadows followed them, creeping closer and closer with every step. The lights in the house flickered weakly, as if the very power was being drained by the presence of the shadowy figures. By the time they reached the front door, the air in the house had grown thick, heavy with an unnatural chill. Thomas fumbled with the lock, his hands shaking, but the door wouldn't budge. "No," he muttered, yanking at the handle. "No, no, no." "It's locked," Susan cried, her voice rising in panic. "I know," Thomas shouted, frustration and fear bubbling over. He slammed his shoulder against the door, but it wouldn't give. Behind them, the shadows loomed, growing taller and more distinct. They weren't just amorphous shapes anymore. They had form. Figures. Dark, humanoid shapes, their limbs impossibly long, their faces featureless. And they were closing in. Thomas's heart pounded in his chest as he turned to face them, the flashlight shaking in his hand. The beam of light flickered, and the figures paused for a moment, as if the light was the only thing keeping them at bay. "Stay back," Thomas said, his voice trembling. "Stay back." But the figures didn't listen. They surged forward, their movements unnatural and jerky, as if they were being pulled by invisible strings. The light from the flashlight flickered again, and this time, it went out completely. The family was plunged into darkness. Susan screamed as the figures descended upon them, their shadowy forms engulfing the room. Thomas swung blindly, his fists meeting only cold air. Emily and Jake cried out, their voices lost in the cacophony of terror that filled the house. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the darkness receded. The house was still. Thomas blinked, his eyes adjusting to the faint light coming from the windows. The shadows were gone. The house was silent, save for the sound of their ragged breathing. But something was wrong. Susan stood in the center of the room, her eyes wide, her mouth open in a silent scream. Emily and Jake were frozen, their faces contorted in fear. Thomas reached out to them, but his hand passed through them, as if they were made of smoke. He looked down at his own hands, and his heart stopped. He was a shadow. They were all shadows now, and they would wait, just at the edge of vision, for the next family to move in. The storm rolled in from the sea, crashing waves against the cliffs, and bringing with it a chill that seeped into every crevice of the old mansion perched on the hill. To the outside world, it was an architectural wonder, an isolated beacon of grandeur that had withstood decades of battering wind and rain. But inside, it was a different story, at least to Eleanor, the housekeeper who had spent the last 10 years of her life serving the whims of the house's cruel and capricious owner, Lady Eliza Wargrave. Lady Eliza was wealthy beyond measure, the heiress to a fortune built on old money and shady dealings. She rarely left the mansion, instead preferring to command her small staff like a dictator from the confines of her opulent sitting room. She delighted in wielding her power, savoring the fear and discomfort of those around her. And of all her staff, Eleanor bore the brunt of her cruelty. Every day was a fresh insult, a new demand, a reminder that Eleanor's very existence was tolerated only by Lady Eliza's capricious grace. Yet Eleanor stayed. She had no family to go back to, no savings to speak of, and no escape from this grim servitude. Lady Eliza's affections were reserved for one being only, her cat, a sleek black creature named Lucifer. The cat was everything to her, more important than the house, the money, even herself. Lucifer was pampered, fed the finest cuts of meat, and allowed to roam freely while Eleanor was expected to attend to its every need. Eleanor loathed the cat. She hated the way it would slink around her feet as she cleaned, brushing against her legs with a haughty air of entitlement, as if it knew exactly how much she despised it and reveled in her inability to do anything about it. She especially hated the way Lady Eliza cooed over the beast, lavishing it with affection and treats while she barely acknowledged Eleanor's presence except to bark an order or hurl an insult. The mansion was vast, with rooms that hadn't been touched in years. It creaked and groaned under the weight of its age, the wooden floorboards sighing like they were tired of holding up the structure. Eleanor's days were spent scrubbing and dusting, polishing the tarnished silverware that would never be used, and preparing meals that would be picked at, criticized, and left to grow cold. But it was in the laundry room that she found herself most often, lost in the mindless rhythm of washing, drying, and folding. It was a day like any other, dull gray light filtering through the small barred window of the laundry room, casting a cold pall over the space. Eleanor was folding sheets, her hands working methodically, when she heard the telltale click of Lucifer's claws on the tiles. The cat had slipped in through the door, its green eyes glinting as it watched her from across the room. It leapt onto the countertop and settled down, staring at her as if it was mocking her silent misery. Eleanor felt a familiar surge of resentment. She glared at the cat, but it only blinked lazily, indifferent to her hostility. She turned her back to it, focusing on her work, but she could feel Lucifer's gaze burning into her, as if the cat could see every dark, bitter thought running through her mind. Lady Eliza had left earlier that morning, off to some appointment in town, and the mansion was quiet, save for the muffled sounds of the storm outside. The washing machine hummed, its rhythmic churning blending with the drumming of rain on the roof. Eleanor closed her eyes for a moment, letting herself imagine a different life, one where she wasn't trapped in this house, one where she didn't have to bow and scrape to Lady Eliza's every whim. When she opened her eyes, Lucifer was still there, but now it had moved closer, its tail flicking idly. It meowed, a soft, almost pitiful sound, as if to remind her of its presence. Something snapped inside Eleanor. She didn't know where the impulse came from, but suddenly she was moving. She scooped up the cat, ignoring its startled yowl, and marched over to the washing machine. It struggled, claws scratching at her arms, but she didn't let go. She wrenched the door open and shoved the cat inside, slamming it shut before it could escape. Her heart was pounding, her breath coming in short, ragged gasps. She didn't think, she just pressed the button to start the machine. The thump and splash of the water drowned out the cat's frantic scratching. Eleanor stood there, frozen, as the machine began its cycle. She could feel a sick, twisted sense of satisfaction curling in her stomach, a grim triumph that tasted bitter on her tongue. For once, she had done something. For once, she had defied Lady Eliza in a way that couldn't be undone with a scolding or a slap on the wrist. The rest of the day passed in a blur. When Lady Eliza returned, she noticed Lucifer's absence almost immediately. Her sharp, shrill voice echoed through the house as she called for the cat, but there was no answer. Eleanor said nothing. She continued with her tasks, pretending not to notice the mounting panic in Lady Eliza's eyes as she searched every room, every nook and cranny, her voice growing more frantic with each unanswered call. By the time night fell, Lady Eliza was beside herself, pacing the halls and muttering under her breath. She even accused Eleanor of letting the cat out, but Eleanor remained stoic, denying any knowledge of Lucifer's whereabouts. Days turned into weeks, and still there was no sign of Lucifer. Lady Eliza's grief was palpable. She stopped leaving the mansion, spending her days locked in her sitting room, staring blankly out the window. Her hair, once perfectly styled, became disheveled, and she no longer dressed in her usual elegant gowns. The staff whispered about her behind closed doors, speculating on what had happened to the cat, and marveling at the transformation of their once imperious employer. Eleanor, for her part, kept her head down and continued her work, though she couldn't help but feel a strange, hollow satisfaction at the sight of Lady Eliza's misery. She had wanted to make her suffer, and she had succeeded. But as time went on, Eleanor began to notice something unsettling. The mansion, which had always felt imposing and oppressive, now seemed suffocating. The air was heavy, thick with a sense of unease that she couldn't quite place, She would catch glimpses of shadows moving out of the corner of her eye, hear faint, echoing meows that sent shivers down her spine. At night, when she lay in her small, cold room, she would hear scratching at her door, like claws dragging across the wood. She told herself it was just her imagination, a product of guilt and paranoia, but the sounds persisted, growing louder, more insistent. One evening, as she was making her way through the darkened halls, she heard a creaking noise from the kitchen. It was past midnight, and everyone else was asleep. Eleanor hesitated, a chill running down her spine, but she forced herself to walk toward the sound. The kitchen was dimly lit, the only light coming from the faint glow of the moon through the window. At first, she saw nothing out of the ordinary, but then she noticed the door to the pantry was ajar. She stepped closer, her heart pounding, and pushed the door open. Lady Eliza was there, hanging from a noose tied to one of the beams, her body swaying gently. Her eyes were open, wide and unseeing, her mouth twisted into a grimace of despair. Eleanor stumbled back, her hand clapping over her mouth to stifle a scream. She felt sick, her mind reeling as she tried to process what she was seeing. Lady Eliza had been so proud, so unbreakable, and now she was reduced to this, a hollow, lifeless husk. As Eleanor stood there, paralyzed with shock, she heard a faint, familiar sound, a soft, rhythmic thumping, like the churning of a washing machine. It grew louder, filling her ears, drowning out everything else, and then she saw it, reflected in the dark, polished surface of the kitchen counter. A pair of glowing green eyes, staring at her from the shadows, unblinking, accusing. She turned, but there was nothing there. Only the cold, empty room and the lifeless body hanging from the beam. The mansion felt different after that night. The storm finally passed, but the air was still heavy, suffocating. The staff spoke in hushed tones, their eyes darting nervously around the house as if they were afraid to see something they shouldn't. Eleanor went through the motions of her work, but she felt like a ghost, drifting through the halls without purpose. She had gotten what she wanted. Lady Eliza was gone, and there was no one left to make her life a living hell. But there was no satisfaction in it, only a cold, gnawing emptiness. She found herself in the laundry room one afternoon, staring at the washing machine. She could still hear the sound of the water sloshing, the rhythmic thump of the drum, and for a moment she thought she could hear a faint, muffled meow. She turned away, her hands shaking, and fled the room. But no matter where she went, she couldn't escape the feeling that she was being watched. The shadows seemed to follow her, twisting and shifting, always just out of sight. She would hear footsteps behind her, but when she turned, there was no one there. At night, she would wake up to the sound of scratching at her door, and she would lie there, staring at the dark, waiting for it to stop. The rain was relentless, pounding against the windshield in an unending symphony of chaos. Emma Bradford squinted through the wiper's frantic efforts, her eyes barely making out the looming silhouette of the abandoned hospital in the distance. It had been a long drive through winding, deserted roads, but she had finally arrived at St. Merediths Asylum, a place shrouded in mystery and fear. Known for its dark past, it was a building that seemed to whisper tales of terror even to those who dared to pass by on the nearest highway. But tonight, Emma was not just passing by. She was going in. Emma was a paranormal investigator, and she had been to many places like this. Decaying mansions, forgotten theaters, eerie woods with sinister legends. She had seen it all. Yet there was something about St. Meredith's that made her uneasy, even as she approached it with her usual determination. The asylum was infamous, known not only for the countless tales of apparitions and ghostly sightings, but also for the mysterious disappearances of anyone foolish enough to wander inside. Many had gone in, hoping to uncover the truth, and none had come out. She knew the risks, but she had prepared herself for this. At least, she thought she had. Emma stepped out of her car, her boots sinking slightly into the mud. She pulled her hood tighter around her face and slung her backpack over her shoulder, feeling the comforting weight of her equipment. Flashlights, cameras, audio recorders, EMF detectors, everything she would need to document the paranormal activity she was certain would be inside. She had been doing this for years, yet as she walked toward the imposing structure, she felt a chill crawl up her spine. The building was a massive, hulking beast, rising up out of the fog like a skeletal hand reaching for the sky. The windows were dark, shattered in places, and the once white walls were now stained with years of neglect, weather, and perhaps something more sinister. As she stood in front of the entrance, she felt as though the building was watching her, its empty eyes waiting for her to step inside. Taking a deep breath, she pushed open the heavy metal door, which creaked in protest as it swung inward. The air inside was stale and heavy, carrying the faint, almost imperceptible scent of decay. She shone her flashlight around, revealing a grand but dilapidated lobby. The reception desk was still there, covered in a thick layer of dust, with papers scattered across it as if someone had left in a hurry. Old faded posters lined the walls, showing images of smiling doctors and nurses, but their cheerful expressions were warped, distorted by time. Emma had done her research. She knew St. Merediths had been operational from the early 1900s until its sudden closure in the 1970s. There were rumors of unethical experiments, of patients who had been locked away and forgotten, their screams unheard, their existence erased. But nothing concrete had ever been proven. It was why she was here, to find evidence, to uncover the truth that had been buried for decades. She set up her camera on the reception desk, positioning it to capture the vast emptiness of the lobby. And then she began to explore. The first few minutes were uneventful. The building was just as she had expected, empty, decaying, and filled with the eerie silence of abandonment. But as she ventured further down the hallway, she began to hear things. At first, it was just a faint whisper, barely audible over the sound of her footsteps. She paused, straining to listen, but there was nothing. She took a few more steps, and there it was again, a soft, breathy voice, just on the edge of hearing. She turned, shining her flashlight down the dark corridor behind her, but there was no one there. She was alone. "Hello?" she called out, her voice echoing through the empty halls. "Is anyone here?" There was no response. She waited for a moment, heart pounding, before turning back and continuing down the hallway. She had just convinced herself that it was nothing, perhaps the wind or the creaking of the old building, when she heard it again. This time the voice was clearer, louder, and it was unmistakably her own. Emma. She froze, her blood running cold. It had been her voice, exactly her voice, as if she had been calling to herself. She swung her flashlight around, the beam cutting through the darkness, but there was still no one there. She swallowed hard, trying to keep her fear in check. It wasn't the first time she had encountered something strange on an investigation, but this felt different, more personal. She continued down the hallway, following the path she had mapped out earlier, but the layout was wrong. She had studied the blueprints of the hospital, memorized the locations of the rooms and staircases, but now the corridor seemed to stretch on endlessly, twisting and turning in ways that made no sense. It was as if the building itself was changing, shifting around her, trying to confuse her. Her flashlight flickered, and she tapped it against her palm, trying to get it to work properly. The light stabilized, and she found herself standing in front of a door she was sure hadn't been there before. It was slightly ajar, and from the darkness beyond, she could hear faint, rhythmic beeping. It sounded like a heart monitor, the kind she had heard countless times in hospitals. She pushed the door open, revealing a small room that was completely out of place. Unlike the rest of the building, this room was clean and well lit, with white walls and a single hospital bed in the center. On the bed was a shape covered by a thin, white sheet. Emma's heart raced as she approached it, her footsteps echoing unnaturally loud in the otherwise silent room. She reached out, slowly pulling back the sheet. Beneath it was a mannequin, its face blank and expressionless. But as she stared at it, the mannequin's lips began to move. "Emma," it said, its voice a perfect imitation of her own. "Why are you here?" Emma stumbled back, her flashlight slipping from her hand and clattering to the floor. The mannequin's eyes, previously lifeless and hollow, were now fixed on hers, filled with an unsettling awareness. She scrambled to pick up the flashlight, her hands shaking, and when she shone the light back on the bed, the mannequin was gone. Her breathing was ragged as she backed out of the room, slamming the door shut behind her. She needed to get out of here, to regroup and figure out what was going on. But as she turned to head back the way she had come, the corridor was different again. The walls were narrower, the ceiling lower, and she could see doors on either side that hadn't been there before. She felt a sense of dread wash over her as she realized she had no idea where she was anymore. The hospital was playing tricks on her, guiding her somewhere she didn't want to go, but she had no choice but to keep moving forward. The whispers were getting louder now, overlapping, filling the air with a chorus of voices that all sounded like her own. "Help me," one voice said, trembling with fear. "Why did you come here?" another asked, accusatory, almost angry. Emma quickened her pace, trying to block out the voices, but they only grew louder, more insistent. She turned a corner and found herself in front of another door, this one marked operating room. She hesitated, but then she heard it, a faint rhythmic tapping, like someone was knocking on the other side. She opened the door, stepping into a room that was pitch black except for a single flickering light bulb hanging above an operating table. The table was stained, the metal rusted, and there were dark, dried streaks on the floor that she didn't want to think about. She could feel something in the room with her, something watching her, but she couldn't see it. "Emma," a voice whispered from the darkness, so close it felt like it was right next to her ear. "We've been waiting for you." She spun around, her flashlight cutting through the darkness, but there was nothing there. Then the light bulb flickered again, and for a split second she saw them. Figures standing around the room, their faces hidden in shadow. They were all staring at her, their eyes glowing faintly in the dark. She backed away, but the door had disappeared. She was trapped, surrounded by the shadows that seemed to pulse and shift, closing in around her. The voices were louder now, echoing off the walls, overlapping until they became a cacophony of noise. "We've been waiting for you," they chanted, over and over, their voices rising until it was deafening. "We've been waiting." Emma felt something cold brush against her arm, and she screamed, dropping her flashlight. The light went out, plunging her into complete darkness. She fumbled for it, her fingers trembling, but then she felt it again, a hand, cold and clammy, wrapping around her wrist. "Why did you come here, Emma?" The voice whispered, and she realized it was no longer mimicking her. It was something else entirely, something that had been waiting for her just as it said. She yanked her hand free, stumbling back, and suddenly the lights came on, blindingly bright. She was back in the lobby, standing in front of the reception desk where she had started. Her camera was still there, the red light blinking as if nothing had happened. But she knew it had. She could still hear the voices, faint but insistent, whispering her name. And when she looked down, she saw it, the word "stay" scrawled across her wrist, in dark, dried ink that looked disturbingly like blood. Emma backed away, her heart pounding, and as she turned to leave, she saw her reflection in the glass of the entrance door. But it wasn't her. The figure staring back at her had her face, her eyes, but it was smiling, a cold, knowing smile that sent chills down her spine. And then it spoke, its lips moving in perfect sync with hers. "We're not done yet." The door swung open, and she ran, the rain drenching her as she sprinted back to her car. But as she drove away, she could still hear the voices, faint and echoing, following her, whispering her name over and over. She had come to uncover the truth about St. Merediths, but now she realized that some truths were better left buried.